I'm Norma Levy, president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization, and today we'll be discussing a 1967 romantic comedy drama, Two for the Road. It's directed by Stanley Donen, and it stars Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to our curator and host, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Okay, thank you, Norma. Happy holidays to everyone. And it's really a pleasure to revisit this film again. We actually showed it at New Plaza Cinema back in 2019 when we were at our former address there at the New York Institute of Technology, right around the time, well, in honor of Albert Finney. He had passed away. And we showed that and Tom Jones. Unfortunately, we didn't get much of a turnout. We still hadn't gotten the knack of when and how to screen classic films. We've gotten a little better at it now at our subsequent theaters. But Max, who's with us today, came to the screening of Two for the Road. He spoke about it. He may repeat one or two of those interesting anecdotes. And I understand today that we had one of the larger signups that we've had, both for yesterday's lecture and for this film, which shows, I think, the resonance that this film has. At that time, I tried to contact a writer that many of you may have heard of named Mark Harris. He published a book on Mike Nichols recently. He's done a couple of other excellent film books. And he had written a very, very good series back in 2017, which you could find on the internet, about films released in that pivotal movie year of 1967, when there were a lot of things were going on, transition-wise, content-wise, artistically, in films in America and around the world. And Two for the Road was one of many films that he wrote about in this essay. There's probably about 24 altogether, like 2 a month. I really recommend that series. He's a big fan of the film, and I'm going to quote one or two things from him today in the course of our discussion, including right now. He says at one point in his piece, "Welcome to one of the funniest, saddest, most brittle and brutal American comedies ever made about the long, long road of wedded ambivalence, with Albert Finney and Audrey Hepburn as your unassailably glamorous guides. Stanley Donen's Two for the Road, and it alternately sweet and wrenching a set of scenes from a marriage, was one of the first unsuitable for children movies ever to play Radio City Music Hall, alongside, believe it or not, a short film salute to the Canadian Centennial and the opening of Expo 67, possibly the strangest double feature of all time." But the film was not taken as the act of Épater le bourgeoisie rebellion that many of more 1967's famous movies were felt to embody, but the sting of Frederick Raphael's Oscar-nominated screenplay is as acute as any movie of the era, and the sophistication of the structure, which we're going to talk about today, remains remarkable. Max, we'll have to see whether your trailer tries to mimic this in miniature.
Thank you, Gary. This was not an inexpensive film for 20th Century Fox to make. The budget apparently was around $5 million. It's about $40 million today. But I guess they were so distracted with Dr. Dolittle that they didn't focus too much on what Donen was up to. And I have to give their sales force some credit here. They do a really good job trying to discourage people to buy tickets. This trailer doesn't really make you want to see this wonderful film, Two for the Road. It focuses on some of the less sophisticated aspects of the film. But let's take a look at the original marketing tool to get people in 1967 to see Two for the Road. Here's the original 20th Century Fox trailer.
Ah! You love me? Do you? Do you?
Yes!
Okay.
Watch Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney make something wonderful out of being alive.
Listen, sweetheart, we're not gonna make it together, see? We don't get the breaks. So this is a kiss-off.
Look! Bastard.
Give us a kiss.
Are you a virgin? I was 2 years at the University of Chicago.
Studying virgin detection?
Oh, shut up.
Henry Mancini made the music. Frederick Raphael, who won an Oscar as the author of Darling, wrote the script. And Stanley Donen is the man who made the movie, in which Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney make something wonderful out of being alive.
I love you, if that's any good.
I love you.
You don't know what love is. I hate you.
Joanna, listen!
I never want to see you again.
Not much! Ow!
As long as I live.
Joanna!
No!
I've decided we should get married! What do you say?
Yes!
Audrey Hepburn and Albert Finney make something wonderful out of being alive in Two for the Road.
Cheat! Cheat!
Oh, I'm so happy, I'm so happy. I love you.
I will say this, the trailer did feature that clip on the cliff where they've been arguing and then she rushes into his arms. But I really looked at the clip this time, and because I was watching the film last night and she appeared out of nowhere. You don't see Audrey Hepburn running into the shot. Maybe Dan is going to comment on that later, but she just appears. I don't know what was up with that.
There's a few tricks played in that trailer, I think, in terms of how characters are woven in and out of certain scenes. That may be the most notable one.
Yeah, no, definitely. So this was a film that Donen made on the heels of already directing Audrey Hepburn in Charade in 1963.
Which we're going to screen at New Plaza Cinema on Sunday, December 22nd.
That's very exciting.
In the plug department.
Because I have such warm memories of hosting or introducing your screening of Two for the Road at New Plaza, March 10th, 2019, and seeing
Holy
it
cow.
on the beautiful big screen in DCP was really wonderful. I did get a sense, and I have seen this many times, and I guess I have different reactions every time I see it. It wasn't a big smash in 1967. It was, I guess because of the cost, it was considered a disappointment. But even if it had been not as expensive to make, I imagine audiences, unless they had a diet exclusively of Jean-Luc Godard and other European filmmakers, would have been very disoriented by the structure of the film. What do you think, Gary?
That kind of cutting and structuring, I guess, was unusual at that point. Now, the vinegar-soaked view of a marriage wasn't completely unfamiliar to American audiences, who the year before had made Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf a big commercial hit. Of course, that was a much more melodramatic and acerbic portrait of a marriage. I think I may have told the story here about an uncle of mine saying that he had seen it in the theater and then had to go back and see it at a drive-in so that he could laugh hysterically all through the film at the insults that Dick and Liz were throwing at each other in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. This is somewhat of a different story, but I don't know. Maybe now today it seems not unfamiliar to us, but the screenwriter Frederick Raphael had created another terrific screenplay a couple of years early, Darling, for Julie Christie, her Oscar-winning role. That, of course, wasn't a big commercial film in America, but it was successful on its own terms.
Yeah, and he continued the marriage theme 2 decades later in Stanley Kubrick's last film that he co-wrote, Eyes Wide Shut. That's never been a huge favorite of mine.
We keep threatening to do it on this program. We'll have to see if anybody has any comments about that today. You know, a Frederick Raphael double feature or something there.
And also, you get a sense, and I know we'll be talking more about that this idea of a narrative going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, we have them, well, present day in the sense that they have a child, he's very successful, they're not happy. And then we see them when they're just starting out, and then we see them in the middle of all this. And the narrative is going back and forth. We see that form of storytelling a lot today on television and in features. The streaming series model, where the action is going back and forth and in the middle and to the end and the beginning. but you didn't see that a lot in a commercial Hollywood picture
True.
at the time.
That's for sure.
And certainly this is something that would have been part of the way that the film was structured by Frederick Raphael, with obviously Stanley Donen's supervision. I have to say, we can argue about how deep a movie Two for the Road is. I mean, it's very glossy, and it's got these stunning locations, which I know Dan will talk more about the filming of Two for the Road. But I actually think it's a lot deeper than perhaps its reputation warrants. I think you mentioned Who Was Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, that is so over the top in its portrayal of a marriage. And yes, we have these two stars in very glamorous trappings, but the banter and the sarcasm and the heartbreak that's going on, it's quite accurate when it comes to marriage. Now, granted, you're dealing with marriage at a certain class level, but it certainly shows all the idiosyncrasies. What do you think, Gary?
Well, our friend Mr. Harris here in his piece, I think, addresses this directly a little bit later on. He writes, under Stanley Donen's steady hand, Two for the Road does what only a Hollywood movie can do. It convinces it convinces you that two beautiful movie stars tooling through France in a car are just like us. It's everybody's marriage that's on trial in this film. If you have ever failed to let a fight go, or said one thing too many, or kept silent rather than apologize, you're likely to recognize a bit of yourself in the shards of the Wallaces.
I think that's brilliantly stated.
Yeah.
Because everything that we see is part and parcel of a marriage, and regardless of whether you're in these glamorous characters, I think that's very, very well stated.
Sorry, Max, I have to chime in and give you a quick anecdote from Stanley Donen's.
This is Dan Cahill, who'll be joining us again.
Yeah, I'm early here because it's very apt. There is a scene towards the end where Albert Finney intrudes on a lunch between Audrey Hepburn and the character David, who is her lover at that point. And it's really raw dialogue and very difficult. And Donen said that all three of the actors in that scene were very pained going through it because they had all experienced some sort of situation like that in their real lives. And it was a very challenging scene to shoot. I will just report that from the director. Now, I'll go mute again and see you soon.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm glad Dan mentioned that, because at the time this film was made, Audrey Hepburn's marriage to the actor Mel Ferrer was coming to an end. So she was dealing with divorce proceedings while making this film. So I can just imagine what that scene and others, what that might have brought up for the actress. The character that was a bit of a controversy from the beginning when the film came out was the Albert Finney character, because he's not all that likable in a lot of the film. And I go back and forth on Finney's portrayal of the husband. He seems over the top in a lot of his scenes. Watching it again last night, about halfway through, I was saying to myself, I think he's supposed to be American. I wasn't sure because his accent was all over the place. But then he has these moments where he's really connecting with Audrey Hepburn's character. Donen had something very interesting to say in a very compelling biography that was written about him called Dancing on the Ceiling. He said that he thought the film, and I'm quoting him, it came out a little one-sided. Two for the Road is not meant to be as downbeat as it is. If you read the script, you won't get the same feeling. The husband and wife are supposed to be equally responsible for the difficulties in the marriage. And the story is supposed to be about what happens to people when they become too familiar with each other's habits, how our little idiosyncrasies eventually irritate us and cause us to drift apart. As I said, it came out a little one-sided, like that's the Finney character, is a bit of a jerk, and he wasn't supposed to be. And Donen, years after that, commented that Albert Finney didn't like to play charming roles, even though he was very charming in Tom Jones. So he liked a bit of a scoundrel, and you do get a sense of that here. I also, Gary, their background of the characters, where they were from, did we get a sense he mentions going to the University of Chicago.
That's right.
But other than that, we don't know if he's a Brit or a Yank.
Well, I think it seems clear that he's a Yank, and there's another line where he says something like to her when they first meet, talking about his experiences with American girls at the University of Chicago. He says, "Your nicely brought up American girl may play it cool and modern, but what she wants is what her grandmother wanted: your head stuffed and mounted on the living room wall." And so that's which seems to me like a view of America from, as we would say, across the pond.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my favorite view from America was the ugly American tourists of Eleanor Braun and William Daniels. I was laughing just throughout the glimpses of that family that Audrey and Albert had to endure in one of the flashback scenes. And it was, of course, Eleanor Braun, for the next Stanley Donen film, is going to have an even bigger role because she is the object of Dudley Moore's affections in Bedazzled. She's the girl he wants and that the devil is trying to negotiate.
His other film from 1967, a very good year for Mr. Donen.
Exactly. It was kind of the pinnacle of his directing career. And then William Daniels, 1967, was a big year for him because he really excelled at this ugly American suburban bourgeois figure, because he steals a comedy from the same year, the Theodore Flicker's The President's Analyst, where he's a gun-toting suburban liberal. And then at the end of the year, he's Dustin Hoffman's father in The Graduate. So that was a big year.
I'd forgotten about that.
So I just love the scenes with them and their daughter Ruthie. I just thought were
well. I think two very well trained stage actors, and they really know how to deliver those zingers and those biting lines. And the little girl too, was she said, "Daddy, why is Red China a bitch?" That was one of her many hit lines.
There's so many great lines in that sequence, and the film had the advantage of coming out as the production code administration was falling to pieces. It was on the eve of the rating system. So this film had initially encountered, and I believe Mark Harris, whom you had cited, Gary.
Yes. They sparred with the production code, but they somehow, as he puts it, they outlasted the production code. The production code was on its way out in 1967, in large part due to films like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And it kind of, that faded, that opposition faded into the woodwork as the film was in production.
Because initially Jeffrey Sherlock, who was one of the better, he was one of the more open-minded censorship bosses there. He was concerned about the premarital sex relationship between Mark and Joanna, and he thought there needed to be more of a moral framework required in order for the code to approve it. He was worried about the vulgar dialogue, including the famous closing exchange between the two of them.
Yes,
which actually, ironically, gave the film the heart that some people felt maybe it was missing at times, where you did get a sense that these two were meant to be together. But fortunately, the code was not able to prevent some of those changes.
Well, yeah, Jeffrey Sherlock, an aptly named man named for the head of the production code, right?
Precisely.
Just that stuff out.
Precisely. So there's so much to talk about. I know we're going to hear more about the technical side from Dan, because this was strikingly photographed in widescreen by Christopher Schallis, and the editing team had very distinguished credits. There was the French, one of the co-editors, Madeleine Goug, had edited Henri-Georges Clouzot's The Wages of Fear and Diabolique. And she also cut Max Ophuls' Lola Montez. So there was and of course we had Maurice Binder. I never knew if it was Binder or Binder, who's famous for the James Bond title sequences, designing the credits for the roads.
Beautiful credit sequence, and maybe Henry Mancini, like his Most Beautifully Melancholy theme, and he wrote a few.
Absolutely. I want to say one word before we get on to Dan about the look of the film, because you mentioned Henry Mancini, and Donnan didn't want, this was according to Mancini himself, Donnan didn't want what was called a long metered melody. He wanted a score which emphasized travel and time. It had a moving figure in the counterline. It was unique. It had heart, and it pushed you along rather than letting you sit there. And the first theme that Mancini wrote did what Donnan didn't want the film to have. So they did some tweaking on that. So there's some very, very effective creative collaborators on this film. And we're going to bring Dan in, who has some more information about how the film was structured before he discusses the look of the film. Dan Cahill, welcome
Yes.
back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, I was privileged enough to have a DVD with Stanley Donnan's audio commentary on it. And he talked about how this story came to be. He actually went to England to work with Frederick Raphael. They liked each other. He liked Darling in particular, but they couldn't come up with anything after a few months. And then Raphael suddenly, an idea sprang from his skull that he remembered that he and his wife had done a lot of motor travel through Europe in their early years of their marriage. And so I guess it occurred to him that would be a nice thing to structure a movie about a marriage. So that back and forth cutting between time frames and places is the way the script was written. Do not deceive yourself into thinking that this was editors going crazy with a story that had been filmed chronologically. No, it was intended to be exactly as you see it. And we will see some some transition shots that were designed exactly for that. Some of them without cuts, but we will go through that in a little while. One other thing that Donnan said, just from reading the script, he said, wow, this is going to be the easiest movie I've ever done. It's just two people in a car. Well, that was until somebody decided we're going to shoot all of this on real locations. Because previously, just about every dialogue scene in a car was shot in a studio with a rear projection background where it was easy to do everything. One of the other challenges they had was the massive amount of equipment that they had to truck around the French countryside with them, which slowed them down, cost them money. Just as an example, they had, I think, 4 different cars in the movie, and they had to have an identical backup car for each one of them. So that's 8 cars, truckloads of lighting and camera equipment, food, toilets, trailers for the actors. It was just a massive undertaking. And one problem that they had, because they had to light so much, the color film required a lot of light at that time. They had loud generators very close to the actors, and that required them to do a lot of post-dubbing on the dialogue because the generator could be heard humming in the background. Now, with that as an introduction, I'm now going to share my screen for the slideshow that I have ready for us. Here we go. So just a couple of things that I think Donnan is a very clever director, and he designs his movies visually. I thought this was interesting. This is the audience's first introduction to Hepburn on the boat with lovely, beautifully lit water in the background. And here's our introduction to Albert Finney, introducing himself as a very clownish physical guy, happy to scoot down a stairwell to pursue his missing passport, which, by the way, comes from Frederick Raphael, that passport gag, because he was always forgetting things. Now, here is one of the first signs of a car scene being filmed for real, and that is the reflections of trees and sky in the side windows and all the windows. And this is a wonderful addition to the reality of the film. It adds depth to the frame, and it makes it look like you're really there with them. which is the whole point of shooting real locations. Here's another window shot. You can still see a little bit of reflections. My theory is that there is a light inside the car lighting her face. Otherwise, it would have been too dark to read. Okay. Why am I? I'm not advancing. Okay. What can I do here? There we go. So this is another idea. Instead of just showing Albert Finney taking pictures of buildings, he shows us the view through a 3D camera viewfinder. Again, it's keeping it interesting for the audience, never boring. This gag, Donnan wanted a traffic signal like that. And he said, now get me one that has the arms going up and down so she can step out from behind it. Well, all the people there said, well, we don't have anything like that in France. So they built him one. Now, this did not, skyrocket the budget, but it was an effort made to have something very cute and adorable, which it is. This is a still frame from the very fast motion sequence. Another visual trope, which had been used before, but somehow it seemed to work here. He didn't overuse it. And, it gives you a sense of frenetic travel, which is kind of what the point of the movie was. Now, here we have William Daniels as Howie, and he's spraying at a bug. Now, the spray can is one of his little motifs in the movie, and this was designed as a transition effect. Now, there is a cut here to the next shot, which is this, which we saw in the trailer, which is another spray. And it actually cuts to a close-up of the nozzle of the spray. So it's a more direct comparison. But this is one of the planned transition shots, as is this thing. Now, this has to have been planned because you see on the left, just in the near background, you see Mark and Joanna walking away from the camera. And in the foreground, here comes some lonely guy in a red convertible, which sets up the transition to this whole sequence with the flirtation between the cars. Interesting that the British car on the left with the steering wheel on the right is mirrored by the French car on the right with the steering wheel on the left. So these people are set up for a glorious flirtation. The fire. Well, what do you do if you have one too many cars? Okay, let's burn one. Donnan says that the building in the background, which is posing as a hotel, was actually a private home. And many people would come to him afterwards and say, I'd love to stay there. Where is that hotel? And he had to say, well, it's just a home that we used for a while, so you're out of luck. I also was enchanted by a lot of the background elements here. This looks to me like an aqueduct, although I'm not sure I really know what an aqueduct looks like, but it was just something, again, to alleviate any boredom in the background. There's another sequence where there are power lines in the background. Very interesting stuff. Keeps your imagination going. Here we have the pipe sequence. It's a shelter from the storm, and later it's a way to get to the Côte d'Azur. Lots of movies have sunset shots. This one throws a kiss in, and these are not easy to do. We only have about 5 or 10 minutes to pull it off, and they managed to get a reflection of the sun in the water, which is nice. For those of you who spotted her, yes, this indeed is Jacqueline Bisset, playing a character named Jacqueline. Mr. Donnan said when he auditioned her in LA, she came into his office and he was so staggered by her beauty that he had a hard time standing up to greet her. As soon as he heard her speak, he just said, you have the part. And this was her second credited performance. She had a role in Polanski's Cul-de-sac, which I have not seen in far too long. And here we have the final closing shot of the film. which I just think wraps it up nicely with two red cars and the blue car going off into their separate paths. So that's the end of my presentation, folks. And I do have other things to say, but yeah, I wanted to follow up on the Mancini comment because Don cited the same thing, that the first score that Hank came up with was just not what Stanley wanted. So he came back with this really beautiful melody, and Donen says he thinks this is the best movie melody that Mancini created, and I agree. And here's one reason: is nobody put lyrics to it. So we haven't heard it performed over and over and over. Are you challenging that?
Dan, forgive me. I don't have the artist's name, but there are lyrics to the song.
I think unfortunately I've heard them too, and I said that unfortunately they shouldn't have done it, but they did.
Well, let me just say this: Moon River and the Days of Wine and Roses are all worn out on my generation. We have heard them so much, they're really boring for us. And I am lucky enough to have missed the lyrics for Two for the Road, so I'm happy for that.
At least those were by Johnny Mercer. I have a feeling these were not. Max, do you have any more details on that?
I don't. I'll have to do a little research on that. But
that's okay.
But here's a question on the look of the film, because it is a stunningly shot by Christopher Chalas. But the one thing that stands out today that can be a bit of annoyance is the playing around with the zoom lens, this zooming in or zooming out. Any thoughts to share on either gentleman on how that was? It overused or appropriate?
Well, that was a heyday of that, because I think it started with commercials, and certain directors like Robert Altman and Mike Nichols, went zoom happy during that period of time. Now, of course, we groan when we see that stuff. Sometimes it's rarely done, at least in feature films.
Well, I will tell you one reason why it is so artificial looking is that the zoom does something that your eye cannot do. Your eye cannot zoom in on something. On the other hand, if you dolly into something, that's the equivalent of you walking up to an object. But the zooms going in and out are just crazy. And I have taught classes on how to disguise a zoom. If you want to zoom from something wide to something narrow, dolly the camera or pan the camera to hide the zoom. So people have learned to do that, and it's no longer quite as jarring. But you're right. Altman went crazy with the zoom, and his films look kind of immature for that reason. In particular, the films of the 60s and early 70s before.
And then we had in the Long Goodbye, which we did in this program a year or two ago, a film where he tracked and zoomed incessantly in the same shot for much of that picture.
Yeah.
And also to answer the question about the Mancini song, on the internet you can find the lyrics that were written for Two for the Road, but they don't mention the lyricist. So
okay.
Probably
hiding in shame, I would think.
A couple of things about some of the other actors in the cast. You had playing the Frenchman, a very affluent man who hires Albert Finney, is Claude Dauphin. He was, one of his bigger credits was in the early 50s. It was for Max Ophuls' Le Plaisir. And Nadia Gray playing his wife. Do we remember where she was most famous for?
La Dolce Vita. She does a strip tease, am I right?
Exactly. She was the one who did that striptease at the decadent bourgeois party that Marcello Mastroianni attends, and that was a good
one of the striptease is done at a decadent bourgeois party in that film.
Precisely. And then, interestingly enough, Audrey Hepburn, despite getting acclaim in this film and also having another hit the same year in the thriller Wait Until Dark, she's going to take something like a 9-year break from the screen. She won't appear in another film until Robin and Marion.
That's right. That's right.
What was her last film? Do you know, Max, offhand?
I'm sorry?
What was Audrey's last film? Do you know?
Her last film, to my knowledge, was her appearance in Steven Spielberg's Always.
1989.
And then and then one of her last appearances prior to that was in Peter Bogdanovich's They All Laughed, but Always was one of her final performances. And she makes it look very easy. She's always very moving and you fall in love with her, you feel for her, you're touched by her. And that just is something that she controls throughout every scene she's in. It's quite a skill.
She was 37 when she made this picture. Finney was only 30 at the time.
Exactly.
And apparently they had some kind of romantic entanglement during the involvement during the production. So you have Audrey Hepburn going through a nasty divorce and having an affair with her co-star. That must have made for some turbulent emotions behind the scenes.
Well, Donovan had nothing but praise for them and their professionalism and their enthusiasm for the project. He apparently did not find any of what you just said to be distracting. But
it's unimaginable.
Go ahead, Max.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, this is regarding the scene where Mark picks her up at the side of the swimming pool and throws her in the pool. Well, Audrey Hepburn had a phobia about being in deep water.
Wow.
And she originally said to Donen, "Can't you do this with a double?" He said, "No, it just won't work that way." So what they did was they had ADs, assistant directors, standing just outside the frame line, ready to dive in and rescue her if there was a problem. Okay, take one, tosses her in the water, and one of the ADs was so enthusiastic, he dived in and ruined the shot. Didn't leave any time for her to be in the water. And ruining that shot meant they lost, several hours while they re-wardrobed her, redid her hair. I guess that poor AD probably lost his job. I don't know. But over-enthusiastic.
Well, these are things we don't think about when a movie is being made, that when you do a scene like that, for take two, you have to prepare the actor or actress all over again and draw, everything has to start from scratch. And there was an anecdote that was shared in the biography of Stanley Donen. This was by Steven Silverman. He wrote it in 1996. 20th Century Fox, they already had booked Two for the Road into Radio City Music Hall, and they arranged a press junket here in New York City to promote the film. It was attended by college newspaper editors from around the country. And Stanley Donen and Frederick Raphael shared the dais with the then film critic at the New York Times, Bosley Crowther, who was going to be having a rather bad year because this was the year that he panned Bonnie and Clyde. I'm sure Gary will tell us more about that. According to Donen, the student newspaper editors hated Two for the Road. They just hated it. And I'm quoting Donen here. He said, "I thought I'd flown across the Atlantic to meet the intelligentsia of the United States that morning. I didn't. Who I met there, were the future publicists of America, the future toadies. Having been led by Bosley Crowther, these kids proceeded to rip the picture apart until there was nothing left of me or it. Then Bosley Crowther got up and he walked over and stood right beside me and said, 'Mr. Donen, I saw your picture last night and it's just another version of commercial American trash. If you want to see what's going on in the movies today, you must go down to Greenwich Village and look at Antonioni's Blow Up, because that is the way movies should be made and the way they are headed.' And he went on to say that Mr. Antonioni had the courage, which no one else had in commercial film before, to show pubic hair on the screen. You must stop making films for Radio City Music Hall and try to make pictures that reach out to the people." Bosley Crowther was cheered and applauded by the entire house. So Donen, he said, "I got up and I said, 'Bosley, if I'd known that pubic hair would have gotten me a good review, I would have brought you a bucket full of it. I've seen Blow Up, and while I have nothing to say against it, it does seem to me to be sort of a combination of Rear Window and Funny Face,'" which Donen directed. "Then I turned to the kids, these college editors, and said, 'First of all, I flew here 3,000 miles to meet you as equals. I thought you'd be intelligent and have decent manners, but you're rude, and you don't even know what you've just seen because it's a wonderful picture. It's a picture full of humanity, about marriage and life. And you, Bosley Crowther, you have no manners whatsoever. You have every right, in my opinion, to say anything you want in the New York Times. They pay you for that. But I'm here as a guest, and you owe me a certain courtesy. And as far as I'm concerned, you're nothing but an impossible son of a... With that, the students burst into a long and deafening round of applause.
Well, and none of these college students, a few, if any of them, had ever been in a real relationship at that point in their lives, so they knew little of what was going on in Two for the Road. And Bosley Crowther, he may have had some degree of intelligence or discernment over his 27-year career as a Times critic, but by that point he had bottomed out, and a few months later his tone-deaf review of Bonnie and Clyde cost him his job. That was the end of Mr. Crowther.
I do have a wonderful, this could be a closing anecdote, it doesn't have to be, but Mr. Donnan talked about how over the decades, now he was doing the commentary, I think about 25 years after the movie. And he said over the decades, people had come up to him, including strangers, people on the street, people he didn't know, who told him how important Two for the Road was in their lives and in appreciating their own romantic relationships. And it had been a very, very important film for them. And he said carrying those reactions with him had been the most satisfying experience as a director in terms of audience reaction. So it meant a lot to Stanley. And I think it has to us and to most audiences, assuming they were old enough at the time. I first saw it when I was in college. But I had had a serious romantic breakup the year before, and I got it. I knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, Max,
I was about 13 or 14, and I didn't quite get it yet. I admired the technical side of it, but I didn't quite get the whole relationship connections and the symbolism there.
He had a colorful personal life on his own, Max. I believe you quoted something from him when you spoke in March of 2019 at the New Plaza Cinema, having to do with the number of marriages that he had and the circumstances and how some of them came about.
Well, he was married, and I mentioned this briefly yesterday, but he was married 5 times. And apparently he said his motto was eat, drink, and get married.
That's the quote, yes.
and he would have gotten married a sixth time to Elaine May, whom he directed in a stage play in Connecticut in 2002. They were involved, and he was just madly in love with her. And she said, "Okay, no, we're not getting married. Let's just leave things as they are." But he had experiences with marriages that had succeeded and also failed.
I remember having an unusual conversation with him. This would have been in the early 2000s or so, at the Cannes Film Festival on a boat, some kind of industry party, and a couple of us were very pleased. I don't know what he was doing there, but we were pleased that he was there. We started speaking to him, and I said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Donnan, in your first picture on the town," and he looked at me and he said, "How did you know that was my first picture?" And I said, "Well, some of us here we're not just numbers crunchers, and we're interested in movie history along with that other stuff." But he was somehow deeply skeptical. Why did we know that? And why was that germane at all? But otherwise he seemed like a pleasant fellow. Yeah. Well, this was a bunch of supposedly film industry people and he was promoting something or other. I don't know what. But,
well, it's interesting. I'm wondering if maybe he was a little overly sensitive because he had always been linked to Gene Kelly and Singing in the Rain and On the Town, and he was frustrated not being recognized for his solo films as a director. Maybe he was responding a little sensitively for that reason.
I think it had probably been a while since he had made a picture at that point too. I think his last film had been like in the mid '80s or so. So that
the last So someone had reminded me yesterday that he did some television work, like he did some choreography, directing some choreography on the ABC series Moonlighting for a musical episode. But his last theatrical feature, unfortunately, even though it was a big success at the box office, was it was this rom-com called Blame It on Rio with Michael Caine that just didn't work. But it was successful, but the critical response was so negative, it did not result in a lot of other job offers. And when Frederick Raphael was working on the script For Eyes Wide Shut with Stanley Kubrick, he mentioned talking to Donnan recently, and the other Stanley wanted to know how Donnan was, and Raphael, and this was already the 90s, was saying, I think he'd like to be directing more. So even by that time, he still was saddened by the fact that the offers weren't coming.
Well, certainly he's going to be remembered by the likes of us for that great trio of musicals, On the Town, Singing in the Rain, It's Always Fair Weather, also Funny Face, Charade, and those two films from 1967, Two for the Road and Bedazzled. So not a bad filmography.
No, not a bit. There's a lot to be proud of there, and we're excited that you'll be bringing Charade to New Plaza later in December, Gary. That's wonderful. At this time, we may have people who would like to share comments or questions, and Lori Turchin, our host, can assist us with fielding any questions or thoughts from people.
Hi, everyone. If you have a question, go to your reaction. Oh, Marjorie, can you unmute and start your video, please? And for the rest of you, if you could please raise your hand by hitting your reaction button. Marjorie?
Hi, thank you. I'm so glad, Dan, that you brought out those reflections in the car windshield. That really, really stood out in my mind because I don't think of another movie that did that. So that was really interesting to me, and they did it many times. Also, I expanded on this movie's theme that this is just like life, not just a marriage. That, there are good times, there are bad times, no matter what, with friends, neighbors, a job. That's how life goes. So it wasn't just a marriage. It's, life just doing its thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you.
One comment from Stanley Donen about the script and the way it was structured was that every single scene in the movie was intended to have a feel of being in the present tense. He never wanted the audience to go, oh, now we're going back to that, we're going forward to that. And I think that kind of is in sync with your comment about it's like life.
And that's actually how I took it, that now we're here, but now we're there. That's right. It wasn't really a flashback where somebody's reminiscing about something. You just had to follow and figure out that this is them, this is now. I thought it was very good. I don't think it's a great movie. I wouldn't say to somebody, oh, you've got to see it, but I think it's a worthwhile movie.
Agreed. Thank you for your comment,
Marjorie.
Thank you,
Marjorie.
Just a quick note from Lou in the chat that according to the soundtrack album, Leslie Bricusse was the lyricist for
another James Bond connection to the film. The credits at the beginning of the film are by Maurice Binder, who did many of the Bond montage sequences there in the 60s.
And that lyricist, Leslie Bricusse, also often collaborated with Anthony Newley on a lot of popular songs in the 1960s.
James Bond Thunderball, I think he did those lyrics.
Thank you, Lou.
Joshua, would you like to unmute and start your video?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Joshua.
Yes.
Okay. I thought it was a marvelous film. And I saw it a long time ago. In terms of it reflecting how life was, I did a European trip with my first wife right after college, which did not survive European tour. So I know what the hell he was talking about.
That's really painful.
Yeah. Real life for you, Joshua.
Well, thank you for sharing. And just to resort to some locker room banter, please forgive me, but I have to say, for Albert Finney's character, choosing between Audrey Hepburn and Jacqueline Bisset, I don't know. I may have. I may. I love Audrey, but I may have waited for the chicken pox thing to subside with Jacqueline, so that that's just me. That's a pretty tough choice.
Let's not forget that Ms. Bissett, Gary will remember the year, I think it was the summer of last year, that she paid a visit to our big screen cinema.
That's right. There was a small independent film that she was in. And unfortunately, I'm blanking out on the title. Someone will have to help me with that.
I know it. It's Lauren and Rose.
Lauren and Rose. That's right. And she was in it. She co-produced it. She came to us. She liked our theater very much. And that's how we wound up playing Claude Chabrol's The Ceremony at our cinema earlier this year. She really wanted us to bring that film back. She didn't feel it had gotten its due in the U.S. And we had a nice screening with good attendance in February of this year when we showed it.
And I remember she looked terrific.
Oh yeah, we had a full house for her appearance.
She was 78 years old. She just turned 80 this year in September. And wow, that's all I can say.
I'm trying to remember if you were at that screening, Dan. It was a full house and a rapturously appreciative audience there, as you recall.
I was there. I wouldn't have missed it.
So we have
any other questions or about the film? Well, this has been a real pleasure. We are, of course, wishing everyone Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. We'll be back in January. And of course, those of you in New York City, don't be a stranger to New Plaza Cinema on 67th Street, especially when we bring Stanley Don and Charade on December.
We're really packing the schedule with classic films the last 2 weeks of this year. In addition to Charade, we're going to be showing James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause, including a Q&A with Nikki Rose, the daughter of director Nicholas Ray, will be at the screening, and a film historian, Foster Hirsch, whom some of you may know. Yes. We're going to be showing the complete 5-hour Bergman, Fanny, and Alexander, which is set during Christmas time, during the holidays, and also a film which one of our executive members, Sean Moore, I don't know if she's watching today, but a Tracy Hepburn title, which I was not that familiar with, and she contends this is one of their underrated, one of their better vehicles. It's called Desk Set, and it's also set in New York City at Christmas time, so we'll be screening that a couple times during the Christmas New Year's stretch. So keep your eye on the schedule. It's going to be chock full of an eclectic bunch of goodies there to be announced shortly.
And Desk Set is perfect for the cinema because it's color and CinemaScope, just
That's
like
right.
Two for the Road.
We love those widescreen films. Our screen may not be huge, but it respects the frame.
Well put.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you all, and
Happy
Gary
holidays.
and Dan and Laurie.
Happy holidays to everyone.
Thanks for everyone's hard work for this year, and we'll be back next month with
See you next
another
year.
film. We haven't announced it yet, but we will soon.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.